Very much for that, Sherry. You pronounced my name perfectly, so don't worry about that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mansoor Soni. On behalf of Bazaars, our co-sponsors, Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, dear Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, and the UCT Graduate School of Business, it gives us great pleasure to welcome and introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, Mr. Jeremy Sampson. I understand that Mr. Sampson graduated from Canterbury University in England and moved to South Africa to start his own company, Jeremy Sampson and Associates, after a stint in the UK. He's the recipient of well over 100 creative awards and sits on the boards of various companies and panels. He is also the recipient of the Lifetime Achiever Award by Financial Mail at Focus, and his company, Interbrand, is also, I forgot to mention, is the founder and the group chairman of Interbrand Sampson, which is also the recipient of FinWeek's Best Design Agency of the Year Award. Mr. Sampson's been working between Johannesburg and London for the past 40 years, very well regarded in the industry. He also believes firmly in Africa's immense potential, and he's spearheaded branding on the continent, for a long time. And I'm sure that his topic tonight on the best global brands, I'm sure we're all keen to hear his thoughts on that. So without any further ado, Mr. Jeremy Sampson.
Thank you very much for that. Good evening. Nice to be here again. Some of you know I'm a visiting professor here as well, so we've had the MBA session this morning and another session tomorrow, so one packs it all in. I also have to make a correction. A lot of people think I'm a graduate of Canterbury University. I went to art school. I went to the Canterbury College of Art, and by my age, you can see I've been around a little bit, and I was in Canterbury at the time when they were actually establishing the University of Canterbury. And a lot of people think, well, I got my degree in Canterbury, so I went to the university, but I don't want to mislead people, and the lawyers are really searching. I don't want to misrepresent myself. But I'm delighted to be here. Best Global Brands. You'll notice that we sent out as publicity material for 2013. That was just a teaser. We're really going to talk about the 2012 results that came out in New York last Tuesday. Anyone who watched CNBC, the closing bell at about 10 o'clock our time last Tuesday would have seen Jez Frampton, who's the CEO of Interbrand, with Mr. I can't pronounce his name either, Mr. Hukta, the CEO of Coca-Cola, who's a Turkish gentleman, closing the bell together because Coke was the top brand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about branding, first of all, and then I'm going to focus on the top 100 brands. I think to start with, just to run through, Interbrand Sampson is the African arm, if I can put it that way, of the Interbrand Group. Interbrand Sampson, we originally started in Johannesburg in 1973. The Interbrand Group started in London in 1974. As you heard, I went back and worked in London from 87 to 92, and then came back to South Africa representing the Interbrand Group. So it's a group that's been around quite a long time. Also the fact that we're almost a mini hub now for Africa. As we speak, we've got people from our office working in today Lagos and Nairobi. We're working on projects in Namibia and Botswana. As you'll see later on, we've just rebranded a country in Kenya. So from Johannesburg, we're flying north all the time. And we're rather sad that we don't fly south too often. We don't even go to Durban too often unless we're going to see Unilever. But it's interesting how our world has changed, that more and more work up in Africa. And as we speak, we're working in about 9 different African countries out of the 54 or so. You can see that Interbrand around the world, 38 offices, 20 countries. Just to show you where those countries are. And that's very special because we're talking all the time to our colleagues, and we can talk and learn, find out what's going on in industry sectors in different parts of the world, and that way we can see and use global best practice and apply it to Africa as well. I'm now going to show you just a little short video, just again to show you a little of the work that's going on around Interbrand.
this royal throne of kings, this scepter of this earth.
Show that just to illustrate perhaps that a brand is not just a trademark. There are a lot of people in this room know all about trademarks. This is where we talk about the brand being a total experience. And as you've seen from that film, those are brands that have been created, being worked on around the world. It's a very lively, vibrant world. People say the world of branding and design is boring compared with advertising. I'm sure there's some people from the advertising world here who might agree or disagree. But advertising tends to get judged still by the 30-second TV commercial. And of course, that's old-fashioned. And you can see that branding now is something that is very dynamic, very, very stimulating around the world. And everyone's realizing that everyone potentially is a brand. I don't know if you've all thought of yourselves individuals as brands. If you think of yourselves as brands, how do you behave? How do you project yourselves? We're in Graduate School of Business, we're in Cape Town. These are all great brands in South Africa. So today we say that just about everything is brandable. Just quickly, some slides to show you some of the South African clients we work with. People like the Sampsons, helping them to turn around an organization that, being in paper, is perhaps at risk, the way the world is moving. Kenya, you've seen a little bit of the work that we did there, and that was a fascinating project, picking up from a McKinsey report, and then developing the whole identity of the country. That was interesting because we did a lot of research first, helped them develop the strategy, then created the look and the feel. We're sad it hasn't been rolled out as strongly as we would hope. I think the minds of people in Kenya are more on the elections coming up, but we hope after that it will start gaining greater traction. The fact that some companies split off companies, so in the case of Mondi, they split off a group, and again, strategy, naming, and the whole look of the whole company as it rolled out. Working up in Nairobi for KCB Bank, interesting the different cultures from West Africa to East Africa, from country to country. I think people joke about the different cultures of Johannesburg to Bloemfontein to Durban to Cape Town, whatever. And it's interesting as you work in different places, you pick up again that different feeling. Very entrepreneurial in West Africa. East Africa, much more slow and measured, but still very, very practiced. And getting into the 3 dimensions of brands as well, so that banking halls now are looking more like foyers of 4-star, 5-star hotels. Working in the area of fashion and perfumes, toiletries, much lighter touch. The importance of a brand being, is it feminine or male? A couple of years ago I was working with Alec Cobb, some of you will know, who does MoneyWeb and SABC program, and it was interesting working with him, and we were live on radio, and we started getting into male, female brands, and he seemed to be quite intrigued by this. And he actually gave a marvelous example, saying how one morning he realized that he was running out of shaving cream, so he said to his wife that she was going near the shops to grab some for him, please, and going off to work, and the next morning looking for his shaving cream, couldn't find it, and of course being a man, he used Gillette. Well, his wife had bought him some Nivea, and he actually said he did a complete double take. He needed to shave, so the only shaving cream was Nivea, so he used it. And I said, well, what did you buy the next time around? He said, I actually bought some more Nivea. He liked it. I think that just illustrates sometimes we get so programmed, so fixated, but of course that's what the marketer wants. They want us to be so loyal to a brand that we say that's our brand. It's a bit like a brand is a friend, a good friend, and you keep that, your loyalty. It's also, of course, a reason, on a different spectrum totally, that someone like Warren Buffett, who arguably is the greatest investor of all time, buys shares in companies that own brands, like the Coca-Colas and McDonald's. I think everyone's wondering why he's bought himself a big train set the last couple of years. It's going to be interesting to see how he makes money. Perhaps he's more clever than anyone else. He seems to be proving that. Another brand that we worked on a couple of years ago, and some of you who were here last year will remember ATA, working there with the telecom team on strategy, creating the name, creating the look and the feel, going into the 3D side, and then help activate it even through photographic style. Is that going to be a successful brand? The reality is that of all new brands, within 5 years, something like 90% disappear. Well, EAT is what? I'm not sure, 3 years, 3.5 years? Be interesting to see if it does survive, because once you survive that first 5 years, chances are much higher that you'll keep going. Then some work we've been doing in Namibia for Namibian health. Interesting, one of the MBAs this morning talking about what's going on in Namibia, how he says it's starting to flourish and blossom, and how a lot of local companies are realizing that they have to react to other brands. This is where I think sometimes South Africa has got a bit of a bad name, South African brands trying to colonize Southern Africa. And I guess this is where we start getting a little bit, is it parochial, or perhaps it's rather patriotic. I was up in Accra 2 months ago talking to some of the banks up there, and they were incredibly patriotic about their Ghanaian banks. The reality is, of course, that as the world changes, more and more of those local brands are going to disappear, sometimes sadly. But as the big boys move in, more and more they'll absorb and then rebrand, and then those little local brands tend to disappear. Looking at CBA Bank, again in Kenya, what's been going on there. Looking at Luminet, which is a telco company, working on networks around the coast of Africa. And interesting, this was, or is, a development from a former CEO of telecom. And then working for petrol companies up in East Africa. What I'm trying to illustrate here, of course, is the range of work that we're doing, the range of companies that want branding. One of the companies we can't show here, but which we've been working on for 6 months, is one of the major mining houses. In the news at the moment, but AngloGold Ashanti, we started working for at the beginning of the year, because they realized that they too are a brand. We find often if we're dealing, up at the executive level, especially in a mining house, they don't like the word brand too much. So rather we use a word like reputation. I know there are differences between the two, but if you're in fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG, you can talk brand if the cows come home. Move into other categories, sometimes you have to be a bit careful with the words you use, because a lot of people still think marketing and branding is one of those soft and fluffy things. Does anyone agree with that? I haven't asked how many accountants are in the room. Only one hand went up there. Oh, two. Ah, that's better. A couple over there. I won't ask how many. I will ask how many lawyers are there? A few more hands. But how many marketers or people in advertising? Well, that's a good spread. So perhaps I'm going to be a bit safer if it gets rough later on. Right? Now to talk about the Interbrand methodology, and I think it's important. A lot of people say, well, how do you get to these figures? Are they thumbs ups, or how do you do it? Interbrand has been valuing brands since the late 1980s. The methodology has been prepared consistently the last 13 years in the same format. It hasn't changed. And it was ISO recognized about coming up for 2 years. There's one other brand valuation methodology which is ISO approved as well, and that's brand finance. And if you know brand finance, I'm sure you do, that's headed up by a guy called David Haig, who used to be at Interbrand. In fact, he and I worked together going back 10, 11 years. But it's interesting when you look at the methodology. And the first thing to talk about is the criteria for inclusion. The first point to make is that Interbrand, in doing the valuation, does it without, I repeat, without without the cooperation of the client. So it's got to be publicly available material. In other words, annual reports, sometimes investment analyst reports, that's the way you get the information. And that allows you to put together the valuation. You can see there 30% of revenues at least coming from outside the owner's country. And this is where you might say, well, if you're in the States, Hershey chocolate is a huge brand. But it does perhaps 95% of its business in the States. It doesn't spread out. And of course that means you're more at risk if you're just in one country. The more ubiquitous you are, the more your geographic spread, the safer you are. Coca-Cola, you probably recall, had problems in Belgium a couple of years ago where they had contaminated Coca-Cola, but it was just the one plant in one country. So whilst it got a little bit rough for a time, they moved on from it and it was fine. You can see that it must have a presence in 3 major continents. It's got to have broad geographic coverage, especially now increasingly in emerging markets. And people say that the big opportunity now for all the major brand-owning companies is Africa. We have a major office in Cincinnati, which some of you will know is the home of Procter & Gamble. And the headline of the main newspaper in Cincinnati, I think it was about October last year, was "The future is in Africa." Diageo, the biggest drinks company in the world, their Chief Executive, Paul Walsh, said he saw Africa as the next big opportunity. He said he saw Africa a bit like China was 11 or 12 years ago. So I think we're in for an exciting time. Also, I know working with people like Unilever in Durban, they have doubled their marketing budget in the last 12 months for Africa. They had doubled it the previous 12 months as well. So that shows you what's going on. You probably don't notice it on the surface, but under the surface, there's a hell of a lot going on. The brand must have a public profile. Interesting that you can be aware of lots of brands, but doesn't mean to say they're big brands or strong brands. Talking with some of the MBAs at lunchtime, we were just talking about the campaigns that get lots of talkability, if we can call it that. There's Cell C and Trevor Noah. Everyone, I think, was talking about it. But what did it do to sales? And I don't know the answer to that, some of you might, but it gains a lot of traction for a short time, but does it go through to the bottom line? I think one of the most famous campaigns a couple of years ago, Budweiser, Was Up, Cadbury's, the Guerrilla television campaign, both of them got lots and lots of talk, but what did they do to the bottom line? This is where the trick is to convert things into sales. Also the fact that of the top 100, you'll see that there are certain brands you might wonder why they're not there. We keep away from airlines. SA Airways is perhaps a good example of why we keep away from airlines, but that happens to be what's happening at the moment. But around the world, airlines don't consistently make money. I think 5 years ago, if you looked at Lufthansa's figures, they were making millions of euros. Today they're in loss. And that's not to say that next year they'll be back in profit, but the fact is they're roller coasters. And if you look at the values of brands, you want consistency. And consistency isn't boring in this case. In previous years, we've often put the methodology of valuation at the end of the presentation, but lots of people were asking questions about it, so we thought we'd put it at the front, because it's publicly available. If you go onto the Interbrand.com website, you'll find most of this data. If you go onto another website, brandchannel.com, brand channel one word, it's hosted by Interbrand in New York, but it's an independent website, and you'll find a lot of this data on it. So look at interbrand.com, look at brandchannel.com, and you'll find it. But the basic way of doing evaluation is the figures. You always start with the figures, it doesn't change. There's got to be profitability, you've got to go back perhaps 4 or 5 years, you've got to go forward 3 or 4 years. The projection, is the brand a going concern, is it sustainable? You look at the role of brand and the role of brand index within its sector, and you look at competitors, and then out of that you work out all the figures. It's interesting that a lot of people say that branding today is becoming more and more about measurement and analytics. We've valued the MTN brand, I think it's 3 times in the last 8 or so years. And one of the big things that's come out of that is that we've helped them prepare a scorecard which they use at EXCO level. So this isn't drawn up just by marketing, it's drawn up by everyone. So everyone on the EXCO relates to that scorecard to see how the brand is doing and how it's performing. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why the MTN brand appears to most people to be a lot stronger than Vodafone. Also, people forget that MTN is in 22 other countries, so it's got a huge geographic footprint. Within the brand section, brand strength section, I should say, we have a criteria of 10 items. We have the internal factors of clarity of the brand, the commitment to sustaining the brand, the protection of the brand, that's the legal aspects, it's crucial. If you don't own a brand in law, you're wasting your time. And then you have to have the responsiveness. Then on the external side, you have the authenticity of the brand, the relevance. Relevance is a big, big word. If you lose relevance, you die. Just look at Nokia. Not dead yet, but will it survive? Look at BlackBerry, has it stayed relevant? So relevancy is crucial. It's got to differentiate from the crowd. It's got to be totally consistent. It's got to have a presence. In other words, it's got to be available if you want it. It's got to be there. And it's got to have an understanding of its market. Again, in emerging markets, what's the general rule of thumb? Half the population under the age of about 22, 23. So if you don't stay relevant with the youngsters coming up through, your brand eventually will become irrelevant. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that someone like a Coca-Cola has been so incredibly successful over the years. They've always stayed relevant. They've always engaged at a very early age. Some of the applications, so this is all the very serious bit, but mergers and acquisitions, investor relations, people forget the amount of money paid for brands. I think one of the best examples was Tata buying Jaguar and Land Rover from Ford. Earlier this year, Pringles chips was sold by Procter & Gamble to, it was Kraft, no, it's Kellogg's. It's to Kellogg's, because Procter & Gamble wanted to get out of the food area apparently, and Kellogg's want to develop away from cereal much more into snacking, and so it fitted their profile. But I think the figure was something like $22 billion US. $22 billion US for the Pringles brand. Quite a thought, isn't it? Let's go on now to the actual top 100 brands. Again, some of you who've seen this will, I guess, have a sense. A lot of the journalists say, well, isn't it boring? It's the same every year. You say, no, it's not the same every year. Values do go up and down. But it certainly is getting less consistent, if I can use those words, than it was in the past. So for the 13th year, Coca-Cola is up at the top. $77.8 billion US. You can see it's gone up 8%, which in the current conditions isn't bad. They have a Turkish chief executive who apparently is breathing fire throughout the whole organization, and it's very, very aggressive. And seeing him being interviewed on CNBC last week, it was very interesting that he was buying up around the world small niche operations. His words were to bolt on to what I'm doing already. So some of you in the UK will know Innocence, the fruit drinks. And that's one of the brands he's bought. So he's buying small niche areas, often with new brands, new configurations, which he's then bolting on to existing operations. But I'll come back to them again in a minute. Apple, you can see, up 129%. Just this afternoon, I was catching up on some reading, and the latest Business Week has got articles about what Apple's been up to. The fact, I think you probably know, it's the biggest company by market cap in the world, $620 billion US. When you actually look at the proportion it makes up of the Standard & Poor's and of the Nasdaq, it's actually destabilizing these elements. At the moment it makes up 4.8% of the Standard & Poor's, and it's 13% of the Nasdaq. And they're saying that just the sales of the iPhone 5 in the last month or so could add to the growth rate in the United States in the last quarter, 0.5%, in other words, 0.5%. That's just Apple. So it's quite incredible what they're doing. We'll talk a little bit more about IBM, Google, Microsoft, GE, McDonald's, Intel, Samsung, Toyota, but those are the top 10. If you go into the top 50, you can see that number 50 is Citi. The banks have been having a pretty tough time the last 2 or 3 years. Some well-known names there that have slipped a little bit up or down, but for the most part, the major brands haven't changed too much. It's the techie brands that are moving around. And whilst the best ones have moved up a lot, there are some that are falling away. Again, if I said to you, how many of you in this room are on LinkedIn? Hands up, please. Who's on LinkedIn? So that's probably, what, 70%. Who's on Facebook? Probably about the same. Twitter? I love Twitter. It's a lot of fun. Keeps me up to speed as well. And then, is anyone on Mixit? Sorry. But again, it's interesting how things have changed. I was asked to review a couple of chapters in the Public Relations Handbook of South Africa a month ago. And I have to say, and this happens about every 3 years, I couldn't believe how out of date it had got in 3 years. People talking about the London Olympics have said this was the first social Olympics, in other words, the first use of social media. But going through the PR handbook, I don't think it mentioned digital or IT or anything. It certainly didn't mention the 3 brands that we just talked about. So this is where things are moving ahead in a very dramatic fashion. Go to the bottom 50, you can see Siemens at 51, through to Gap at number 100. I stress that some brands go in and out simply because we either have the figures or we don't have the figures. And it can be as fickle as that. A couple of years ago, Rolex was quite high up, but then we couldn't have access to the figures. So some of the privately held companies do move around a bit. But you can see otherwise, there's quite a lot of consistency. If we look at the top and the bottom brands, first of all, just a shot saying the top 10. If you can read it, over on the left is Coca-Cola, showing what the value has done in the last 5 years. And you can see it's very consistent. And likewise, if you move to the red one, 2 along, so that's IBM, and 3 along Microsoft, even 4 along McDonald's, they're all very consistent. The ones that have really gone up are the tech brands. So you can see the first black column on the left, Apple, and the second one, Google, have dramatically gone up. Interesting, GE, which is the third black along, roughly in the middle, has started shrinking a little bit. But again, you have tremendous consistency amongst those top major brands. Just to take a step back and to look at Coca-Cola, I was fascinated that it's been a sponsor of the Olympics since the 1920s. And you think of that, every 4 years it sponsors the Olympic Games. I was lucky enough to have an afternoon in the Olympic Stadium, and walking around, of course, one's never off duty. I think I saw one little Coca-Cola sign. And there was a lot of criticism in the UK that Coke were not leveraging the sponsorship. They weren't sweating it in any way. And it was interesting that the criticism got to such a crescendo that the chief executive of Coke from the States issued a statement and then carried out a series of interviews with the top business editors saying, guys, it's cool. Don't worry. We know what we're doing. He said the main thing is that he wanted people all around the world to see that Coca-Cola was a sponsor. After that, he said, we keep the momentum. Also, of course, he's saying that they're blocking out the opposition. As we found in 2010 with the soccer game, Budweiser was a major sponsor. You could buy Budweiser in the stadium, and then most people who tried it didn't like it at all, and they found it too weak for them. But that was it. You couldn't buy it anywhere else. So sponsorship has many different aspects to it, which one mustn't ignore. When we talk about Apple, it really is a phenomenon. I think Steve Jobs died, 53 weeks or so ago. A lot of people said, well, that's it. That's Apple. I think they forgot that most of these companies have a pipeline in place for the next 2 or 3 years in any case. And Tim Cook is a very mature person. He knows exactly what he's doing. And I think he's shown a steady hand. Yes, he's a different person from Steve Jobs. But Johnny Ive, the design director, is still there. Most of the team is still there. I don't think there have been any major fallouts. So it's going to be interesting to see how they can keep going. We had a presentation in Johannesburg at Gibbs last week, and we actually asked Coca-Cola South Africa if they'd invite someone to come and speak for 5 minutes at the presentation. And apparently they were changing positions around, and they said, look, no. So we went to Apple, and I know R.J. von Spondok, who's the main distributor of Apple, that he'd like to come along and speak for 10 minutes. And of course he was there like a shot. And the first slide he showed was a financial data comparing Coke's figures with Apple's figures, giving the quarterly results, and turning to me and saying, well, Jeremy, these figures were from June. Look, Apple's now the best brand in the world, we're the most valuable. And I know, in fact, Brand Finance argue that as well. So it's quite interesting. So there's certainly some rivalry. I think over the years, people have been arguing that Coke was going to be dethroned, and the main contender was Microsoft. Well, Microsoft seems to be losing it a little bit. It's still an incredible brand, but not as vibrant. But you can see, I'm sure Apple won't do 129, but even if it does another, I don't know, 50, it'll be interesting. It'll be way above Coke. So we'll have to see. A brand that some people say is incredibly boring is IBM. But is it? It's maintaining its position. Look at the value of that brand, $75.5 billion US in an incredibly competitive market. Very much a business brand now. And it sold off its laptops, which are now, of course, Lenovo. It focused the business. So it's still incredibly powerful. Google, one of those IT brands. How old is Google? So this is where you compare Coke, which is 126 years, and Google, which is 14 years. And we'll talk about ages a little bit later on, but again, what Google has achieved, how it's sustained it. I think we know that in these IT areas, brands are going to come and they're going to go. I've got a couple of copies of the report to give out, and the write-up there about digital branding is absolutely fascinating. One forgets the brands have already come and gone and disappeared. Looking at Microsoft, so Apple were very, very critical of Microsoft, saying that really they felt it was starting to go the Nokia way. Again, I think that's probably a little bit too aggressive, and Apple would say that, wouldn't they? But we'll have to see. But certainly, I think Microsoft are feeling the heat of it. Another of those boring companies that still maintain their presence, GE. Now, who talks about GE? Yet their muscle, their strength, okay, the way they maintain themselves is amazing. And diversifying into other areas that are growing more rapidly. We find McDonald's very interesting because in the fast food area, after all, we've been in recessionary times the last, 4 or 5 years, it maintains itself. It's gone up 13%. And I think around the world, often in recessionary areas, people are trading down a bit. But instead of spending, I don't know, 30 rand, 35 rand, they might still spend 25, 20 rand. And McDonald's are there. They've adjusted their pricing, and also they adjust their menus depending on the country they're in. So they still appeal to local taste. You've still got the big Whoppers or whatever. If you want that, that's fine. But if you want something else, something local, they've maintained that relevance. And that's where the relevance aspect is key. Intel, up 12%. Incredible. No, it's what we call an ingredient brand. You can't buy an Intel. It's part of something else. But maintaining itself, maintaining its presence, working all the time to stay relevant, and doing it with some success. I think after Apple, a lot of people are looking to Sampson. You can see 40%. Now you think this is a brand where you couldn't buy a Sampson until 12 years ago. It's been around for a long time, but up until that point they were manufacturing for other people who were then labeling them, branding them, whatever. So here is Samsung, in 12 years, has become a huge brand. If I asked how many people use Samsung mobiles in the room? That's low. How many people use Blackberries? How many people use Nokias? And how many Apple? Okay. So Blackberry is the brand of South Africa.
In South Africa.
In South Africa. It was very strange going for MTN 5 years ago I went to Iran and I went to Syria. And it was amazing because you forget that there are American sanctions against Iran. So no American brands at all. And the leading brand there was Nokia, followed by Samsung. Probably that's changed now a little bit, who knows. But Samsung is really on a roll as well. And a lot of people, you have to place your bets on what these results are going to be like in a year's time. I think it will be quite exciting. And then the example of a brand that got into horrible trouble, partly of its own making and partly, should we call them acts of God, yet it's still a fantastically strong brand. And this to us is the example of a brand being a bit like a supertanker. If it gets it right, it can keep on going. Things might get a bit rough for a time, but it will keep on going, and that's what Toyota has done. A very, very successful brand, and what went wrong seems to be behind them, whereas someone like a BP hasn't got out of that miring that they went through, and that's hanging on. I think Toyota, after a very slow start, and they wasted, what, 48 hours, and hey, 48 hours, but today 48 hours is a lifetime. Now they've picked up their game. And then if you look at the brands at the bottom, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, one of the case studies the MBAs were talking about this morning was Harley-Davidson, because it's slipped a little bit the last couple of years. Some of you will remember that they decided that it was a little bit of almost a cottage industry. They had to upgrade, so they went looking for a new chief executive about 3 years ago. If anyone was here last year, please don't say anything, because it was very interesting that the new chief executive laid out his strategy. Part of his strategy was to develop smaller, lighter vehicles, because ladies wanted to be the drivers. As we heard from the MBAs this morning, the ladies wanted to be on top, they didn't want to be behind their man. So they developed the vehicle. But then one of the investment analysts turned to the new chief executive and said, in a clever way, "What bike do you drive?" The answer was, "I don't ride bikes." Yet despite that, Harley-Davidson seems to be getting through it. I would think by now he probably does ride a bike, but at the time, imagine that, pointing someone who doesn't ride a bike. So 96, there is Harley-Davidson, up 10%. It's a brand that deliberately isn't competing with the performance vehicles. It's got an incredible cachet. A couple of years ago, let me rephrase that, 10 years ago, you may remember, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Brands merged to become PricewaterhouseCoopers. The guy who was the senior partner of Pricewaterhouse at the time, when he made his speech to all the gathered partners, told the story of how, having landed this whole agreement, which had rumbled on for, I believe, years and been an on-off type of affair, decided that he wanted a toy. His toy was going to be a bike, so he could go off at weekends on his own and ride. And he told the story of how he had brochures on the table of his kitchen at home in the States, and how he started reading them and going through them. But he said it was amazing that everyone who walked through his kitchen, and apparently he's got about 2 or 3 children, including a son of about 19 or so, every time they walked through, they said, "Oh, Dad, you've got to get a Harley." So in the end, he got himself a Harley. So there was no debate. It wasn't down to performance, it wasn't down to looks, it was the cachet of that brand. Another brand that we've been talking about a little bit is Yahoo. Is that going to survive? Down 13%. Again, one of those brands that I don't know too much about, know the name, but still there. Moët & Chandon, interesting because I thought of it as a luxury brand. It isn't. It's regarded as an alcoholic beverage brand. The luxury brands in the last year have all gone up in value. That's despite a lot of the pundits saying luxury is dead. I think sales have increased tremendously, obviously, in the East, especially with the Chinese. But in Moët's case, they don't do anything else. They just produce champagne. Whereas often you need different channels to market, if I can put it that way. Another fantastic brand, Ferrari, which of course is branching out into other areas through its retail outlets, through clothing and merchandise, keeping that brand very relevant. Apparently, if anyone wants to do any work for Ferrari from a branding perspective, there's one condition. The consultant has to pay Ferrari, not the other way around. So just the bragging rights of saying, "I work for Ferrari." which is an interesting way of turning it around. And the fashion brand that seems to be struggling hugely at the moment is Gap. I know it's available through Stratford, but it's been in and out. It's had its legal problems as well, hasn't it, locally? And Gap is one of those that, being in the fashion field, seems to be slipping away. And of course, fashion is, as we know, one of the most fickle areas to be in. If you look at those rises, and we've gone through them already, but look at the Apple change from 2011 to 2012. Amazon we haven't talked about because it's just outside the top 10. But again, when Jeff Bezos started that company, he was just, electronically selling books. Now he sells all sorts of things. And the experience is amazing. Some of you will know one of the major writers on branding issues are Peppers and Rogers. Don Peppers was out in South Africa about 6 months ago, and he talked about the Amazon experience. And it was interesting, he said, I wanted to order a book, so I went onto Amazon and I keyed it all in and I gave them all my details. And he said, up came a message, but you bought it already. He said, I'd forgotten. He said, I bought the same book 6 months before. He said, what integrity would they actually say to you? Are you sure you really want it? Because you've already got it. And a little thing like that, which, as you know, is so easy to program in. Tom Peters was raving 10 years ago when he was out here, how when he switched on his computer, it said, hey Tom, the first thing that came up. But sometimes those little touchy things that connect you. And certainly with brands today, it's all about the connectivity. It's often the emotional side. We'll say, why would you prefer something like a Harley Davidson? Old, cranky, old technology, makes a hell of a noise, doesn't go that fast, apparently is an absolute swine to drive, yet you prefer that over what, a Suzuki or I don't know what. So there are some of those brands. I think it surprised a lot of people as well as Nissan. In the automotive area, they've done very well. We talked a little bit about Apple. Amazon, as I say, is a very, very powerful brand. It's developing more and more. And I think people, especially in the States, where they're developing a culture now of ordering through their mobile or through their computers, are realizing that they'll get the best deal. So in other words, a lot of people will still go into a showroom and have a look at something, but then they'll go back home and order through someone like an Amazon. And they get a much better deal. And I think that's going to be coming increasingly here to South Africa. Already the marketing magazines that I get from the UK and the States are talking about the gearing up for Thanksgiving in the States and Christmas in the Northern Hemisphere. This is the big time. And they're seeing the whole digital side just growing exponentially all the time. Also, of course, it's increasing partly because, especially in North America and the UK, the rentals of shopping space in big shopping centres or on the high street is incredibly high. So that more and more people are saying, well, let's get out of the bricks and mortar, let's get more and more into the clicks. Sampson we really, I think, talked about. Nissan, as I say, is a surprise, but they're staying very relevant. They're working in a very young market. They even sponsored a racing team at Le Mans this year. So they're going out and sponsoring activity and projecting themselves. I think this is where we live in a time when to market is getting very, very complicated. 10, 15 years ago, those of you in the advertising world will know it was television, radio, and outdoor, and not much else. And it was as simple as that. Now we have so many different channels to market, and especially on the digital side, if they're handled properly, it's a hell of a lot cheaper. In fact, sometimes it's virtually no cost, and it's much more targeted. So people more and more now are using modern technology. There's still obviously a place for what I call traditional advertising and marketing, but you have so many channels to market. Apple's marketing budget currently for the last 12 months in South Africa, just over 400,000 rand. And again, RJ was saying what he works at is creating buzz, as he calls it. He wants people to talk and talk and talk. So whether it's through, again, the Facebooks, the Twitters, whatever, that's the way you project the message. Oracle, Mr. Larry Ellison, and again, through Java code, etc., he's kept on developing. When it comes to the decliners, no real surprises. BlackBerry has taken a difficult time. The last couple of years, it's tended to be the banks have been the main people who've got into trouble. and Goldman Sachs has not had an easy time. Nokia, of course, dropping down, and Yahoo again. And to look at BlackBerry, they're minus 39%. It's a huge drop. And I know in South Africa it's probably one of the strongest countries for all of BlackBerry around the world. But our times are changing. I don't know. In my house, I have two daughters in their early 20s, and they've been BlackBerry for about 4 or 5 years, and they've just changed to Apple. Much to my wife's disgust, but she's on BlackBerry still.
Why did they change? Why did they change?
They felt they were missing out. And their elderly father had been using them for about the last 5 years, and that was getting up their noses over them. So when I've got my iPad and my iPhone in the evening, watching television, looking at the whole thing, they're saying, "Oh, Dad." You know. And on top of it, it's got even worse, because I now have over 1,000 followers on Twitter. So apparently that's got a certain amount of bragging rights. I think it's quite amusing, actually. So BlackBerry, how's it going to save itself? Is it going to do a Nokia? No, it's a fantastic brand, and testimony to how good it is, what you're showing. And I think around the world it's still the brand of the business community more than Apple. But I think it's at almost a tipping point now. One of the competitors of Interbrand, and I don't like mentioning competitors, but I'm going to, is a company called Profit. And Profit in the States does some research in November where they produce a report, typically American, brands on death row. And they list the top 10 brands as a result of their research. Last year, in October, the brand at the top, or nearest to the death cell, was Kodak. And of course, Kodak is now finally gone, and staggered along for a long time. But it's interesting to see the brands that they were mentioning. I think number 5 was BlackBerry. So BlackBerry, well, it's still surviving, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be some sort of turnaround. Goldman Sachs we talked about because they have had a difficult time, but they are the only bank to be in this sector, which is a bit of a surprise. But that shows perhaps that the other banks around have tended to stabilise now. Some of them, especially like UBS, had a very difficult time, but now things hopefully are settling, and hopefully, you know, we're going to see these recessionary times beginning to recede. Nokia is one of the big disasters. Classic example of a brand, 5 years ago, being totally dominant in much of the world, allegedly having a pipeline of lots of wonderful new product, but deciding to sweat what they had, push it just a little bit further, take a little bit more profit, and in doing that, they lost the race. So along come the smartphones, and as a result, Nokia has been knocked right off their perch. I think they're only really still here because they have huge sales, I believe, in China and the East. And if it wasn't for that, they would be slightly further. Boeing and Shannon, we talked a little bit about, minus 13%. But the fact is that champagne sales around the world are going down. People, as I say, are trading down, so even if you still want to have your bubbles, well, if you want your bubbles, why not just have a good South African Grand Beck or whatever? It's, I was going to say half the price, it's actually a quarter of the price, isn't it? And that's non-digital. And then Yahoo, down 13% again. Is this one of those tech brands that's going to eventually disappear? And I don't know. When we look at new entrants, the point to make here is that, I stress again, that these tables are prepared without the cooperation of clients, so we need readily available material. You'll see Facebook there for the first time, so they had an IPO, as you know, so the figures are available. MasterCard listed for the first time, I believe, about 18 months ago, so we've got their figures. Pampers, I'm not quite sure how it got there, because it's Procter & Gamble, but apparently the investment analysts have a complete report on the major brands of Procter & Gamble. I believe they have something like 20 hero brands, and Pampers is the hero brand of everything that they do. Prada, one of the luxury brands, of course, and Ralph Lauren. So to talk a little bit more about Pampers, nappies. The looks on people's faces there. But it's a huge brand. I don't know what's happened to Huggies, that seems to be pushed aside a bit. But around the world, Pampers is a growing brand. Interesting as well that one of the major sponsors of the London Olympics was Procter & Gamble. And what they did was Procter & Gamble doesn't state on all their different brands that it's a Procter & Gamble, like Unilever did. So they took about, I think it was 5 of their major brands, of which Pampers was the lead, and used the London sponsorship by using, I think, apps on mobile and all sorts of things. So that that helped turbocharge Pampers. Facebook is a fascinating story because the IPO is double the value than it is today. It's got over 100 court cases coming along, but it's still an incredible story. And I think, you know, looking at your faces when I said who's on Facebook, it's a fact of life. Making money, incredible invention, Mr. Zuckerberg, a very, very clever man indeed. And I think this is where when we talk in business now, we don't talk about the obvious competitors. You know, especially in the IT field, you talk about the people who aren't the obvious competitors. Those 2 people in a garage somewhere. You know, those 2 people who are working away at university after hours, developing things. That's where these new brands are coming from. And that's where I think life is so exciting today, that it certainly keeps the marketing people on their toes, because they've got to be sensitive all the time. Prada, one of the great luxury brands, huge value to it, and showing how, again, in the luxury sector, they've stayed relevant, they've kept on doing new things. More and more of these companies are developing in the digital area as well to stay relevant. And then on the automotive side, Kia from South Korea. Interesting, invariably if we're talking on radio or television about these results, people will say, well, aren't there any South African brands? Aren't there any African brands? The answer, I'm afraid, is no and no. There aren't even any BRICS brands in the top 100, which you probably have noticed as well. So nothing from the BRICS at all. There are only 4 brands from 2 emerging markets, and 3 of those are from South Korea, and 1 of them is from Mexico, which is a beer brand, Corona. So I think there's lots of opportunities. I think in Africa, one of the main contenders is obviously going to be someone like an MTN, perhaps a Standard Bank as well. Back in 2005, we actually did a ranking of South African brands, but we found it incredibly difficult because we couldn't get the data. You think that if you, in your own minds, thought of some of the top brands in South Africa, I guess one of them would be a Castle, another would be an FNB. But both of them, to get at their figures, they're embedded in other organizations. So that we found it incredibly difficult to, again, keep integrity in trying to prepare local figures. Ralph Lauren is a great fashion brand. Gained a lot of extra publicity this year by designing all the tracksuits for the United States team for London 2012. Rather shot themselves in the foot, though, that they're all manufactured in China. And then MasterCard. MasterCard, I think, and Visa and Amex are really slugging it out. But a very strong brand, doing very, very well, and at the moment seems to have got a lot of momentum in that area. Then another question we get asked is, well, where do the main brands come from? Where are their countries of origin? And the United States has gone actually up 1 point compared with last year. Last year they were 52, up to 53% this year. But again, it's interesting that when you consider it, those 53 brands are domiciled in the United States, but they're totally global. I don't know if you heard the story a few months ago that Apple was being challenged because they, to this day, have never paid a dividend. And one of the reasons apparently they don't pay a dividend is because the cash is so scattered all around the world that to actually get it together to make a payment is incredibly complex. And that's an issue they've been working on apparently for some time. But if you just get your mind around that one, it's quite an interesting reason for not paying a dividend. After the 53, and again, go back 10 years or so ago, and I think the States was up over 60. Then you go to Germany, which is largely the automotive, French, mainly the luxury, Japan, UK, Switzerland, Italy, the Netherlands, South Korea. Then you go on to Canada, which is BlackBerry, of course, and Spain, which is Zara, and then on to Sweden, and as you can see, Mexico at the bottom. So interesting how that breaks up. I guess the nearest South Africa has got to a brand, and it's cheating a little bit, is if you go to Richemont. I think a lot of people still think it's Richemont, not Swiss, as rather Stellenbosch. So you look at the Cartier and brands like that. But if I had French colleagues from Interbrand in the room, they'd be getting very cross with me, because they say Cartier is a great French brand. And then you look at the sectors, automotive and financial services and FMCG at the top. I think we're going to see more FMCG, provided we can see the figures, especially the lower cost items. But you can see again how it splits down, and technology is moving up the ranks quite strongly. And someone asked the question the other day, well, which of those sectors do you think is growing most in value? And of course it's got to be technology. Just going to close off with a couple of slides. One, just to talk about the average age of brands. People forget that Coke's been around 126 years, as of May this year, formed in Atlanta. And someone said, well, isn't it amazing that this brown, fizzy, sweet drink is still the #1 brand in the world? And you think the ages of these brands have been through wars and recessions and difficult times and goodness knows how many marketing departments and chief executives, yet they're still up there. Apple is only 36, a year younger than Microsoft. IBM is another of those oldies, had a centenary last year. Google, the youngest, at 14. The average age of these top 10 brands a couple of years ago was more like about 84 or so. That's because Nokia was there. Of course, Nokia is about, I'm guessing, 135, something like that. It's about 135 anyway. And then you can see McDonald's, 72, Intel, been around a long time. Samsung, as I say, been around 74 years, but you could only buy Samsung for the last 12 years, and then Toyota. Final slide I'm going to show you. If you were to add up the value of those top 100 brands, you'd have seen that last year they went up about 4%. Now, what do you think they've gone up or down in the last 12 months? Any thoughts? To start with, do you think they've gone up or down? Right, we're thinking up. 1%, 5, 10, 20. Any thoughts?
10.
So we've got 10. Okay, I put you out of your misery. So in the last 12 months, a little bit unscientific, but they've gone up 9.1%. But I find it fascinating that, going back to what Warren Buffett is doing, where he's invested in top brands. I was writing a chapter for Jeremy Magg's The Annual, which comes out at the end of November. And again, around the office, we had a little bit of a chat and thought, well, what are the top brands in South Africa that we can look at and measure? And if in your heads you think of what you think are your top sort of 10 brands in South Africa. And we listed people like the Woolworths and the Mr. Prices and the Capitec's and the Sasol's and some of the banks. And we thought, right, and we agreed on the 12, and then we went out and looked at the share price. And I stress this was a little bit unscientific, but we went from mid-September this year to mid-September last year. We didn't worry about dividends at all. We just looked to see what the share price had done. If I said to you, what do you think of those 10 was the worst performing share? You didn't think I was going to make you work, did you?
Cecil.
Prior to that now, Sassel was the bottom share. But it might surprise you to know that the second worst performing share was Capitec, which to a lot of people, and I stress, you look at the share price has done that, and we happened to take it when it was quite low, so you can look at it in a different way. But then the highest, what do you think was the highest? SAP was a very, very strong brand. I think it was up about 40%. But do you think that if you put your money in the bank at the moment, what can you get? 5, 6%? If you had bought Mr. Price shares first, you'd be up 65% or so. So Mr. Price is right up, and someone just said Woolworths, and yes, Woolworths, I think we're up 45%.
Aspen?
Which one?
Aspen.
I didn't look at Aspen, but that's a very good call. But not Sittler Metro, please. Now, if you look at Woolworths, we were talking this morning as well about the way brands can be attacked. And you know, this is a whole different subject, but on digital now it's so easy for one person to attack any brand and try and get a momentum going. And when you think that Woolworths has had Frankie's just before Christmas, it's had problems with publication material, and now it's had racial issues of hiring staff. Yet despite that, their share price and their sales are going up very, very strongly. And it's an interesting debate to know, would it have gone up higher if it wasn't for that controversy? Are they getting a bit accident prone? So after all, 3 incidents in 9 months. And then someone else turned around this morning and said, well, isn't it the whole syndrome that Woolworths, if you want to actually take aim, it's like taking aim at an elephant, you can't really miss. And that's something that's, you laugh, but that's something that McDonald's in the UK have found. A lot of people were lining up, challenging them, taking them to court and all sorts of things. And it gets a bit tricky for major companies, because obviously they don't want these sort of things hitting the media, and they don't want them going on for a long, long time. That's where the speed and decisiveness of action is crucial. I'm going to stop at that point, so 9.1, that's where the brands went up. Thank you very much.
We have an opportunity for questions, but I thought you'd be interested to hear this. Apple's market value has dropped more than $70 billion since the iPhone 5 was released. It's unmatchable.
There's another naysayer. Does anyone have a birthday today? Does anyone have a birthday this week?
Today.
No one has a birthday this week?
In November?
Me too. That's the Scorpio. Whose birthday? I'm trying to give away a couple of books, so I'm asking questions. What was the number 10 brand? That's one for you. And what was the number 100 brand? Well done.
Right, do we have any questions?
So first of all, Jeremy, thank you very
much.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for keeping the score for us so in such detail each year. What my question is really, I'm a little bit confused about the value of a brand. How much of the value of the brand is from added value in the brand, and how much is just from pure hype? If you look at Facebook, it doesn't seem to be adding very much value to the brand. But it's got 1 billion users, so it's got a tremendous value that way. So how do you really value a brand like sort of Facebook? Thank you.
I did ask this gentleman when he came in, no curveballs please. So he's obliged. This is one of the reasons we go through the whole brand strength exercise. You're absolutely right to tease out. Go back a few years, we used to compare brand value with market capitalization. And then we realized that that wasn't strictly comparable. So then we realized we had to tease out more what the brand was contributing to the overall growth of an organization. To give you an example, when we value a brand, we obviously want to know what the valuation is for, but we also want to know the segmentation. So if you look at the segmentation, don't worry, I'm going to respond in a minute. If you get to the segmentation of MTN, we valued it by country. So the 22 countries, because you can get a balance sheet on each country, and you can work out what's going on. With banks and financial services, the segmentation is by the sectors. So is it home loans, is it insurance, is it banking, etc. And then one of the key things is to work out the impact of the brand on that sector. And I remember the first time we valued ABSA, which was in the days of Nanny Bosman, which must be, I'm guessing, 8-9 years ago. At that stage, they had the HP operation called BankFin. I'm sure some of you would remember it. But BankFin hadn't made any money for the previous 3 years. So even though everyone knew BankFin, and BankFin was a big brand, we said it had no value. The chief executive, was very, very upset indeed. He thought he had this most valuable brand. But we said, look, the first thing is if you're not making money, you don't have any value. So that's the key thing. You've got to tease out the part of the brand that's having an effect. One of the other aspects of ABSA, one of the most profitable parts of ABSA, was the insurance broking side. One of the reasons is, of course, that they get all the business from their home loans division through to insurance. So in other words, whilst they're very profitable, it's not because of brand. So this is where we go down with every single client we do, with every single segment, and we try and come to some sort of point where we agree on the contribution of the brand. Now, we valued all the SA Breweries brands back in about 1998. You remember that in 1998, SAB had 8 brands, and 4 of them were casting. Lager, light, draft, and stout. Today, they're up to 250 brands. But when we did that valuation from Graham and Kai, we had to make some assumptions, but this is where we make the assumption with the client as well. So we say, well, there's the upside, there's the downside, let's strike a figure. And sometimes you work it through in different ways to see the effects. But I think they were absolutely shock rigid at SAB to realise not only that they didn't have really any brands of value, but also legally they weren't registered outside of South Africa. So they really had to start almost from scratch, building an organisation that was now global. I hope that answers some of the question.
We have a question here.
Grace, what would you contribute IBM's rise to? Not forgetting that years ago in terms of, it was surpassed by Microsoft. Thanks so much.
A very interesting question, because IBM, as you can see, 101 years old. I'm trying to remember Dick Gersman. Was it Dick Gersman? No, it wasn't. They got themselves a new chief executive about 12 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm trying to remember his name. Help me, someone. Ex-Procter & Gamble guy. But anyway, he looked at IBM and he said, we're all over the place. We're all things to all people. We're in consumer, we're in business. Apparently he picked up the main magazine of the computer industry and found something like 15 ads for IBM in the same magazine, but they all looked different and whatever. And he said, this is rubbish, we need to focus the business. And that's where he and then subsequent chief executives have been ruthless in focusing and focusing and focusing the business. One of the big things they did as well was fire about 15 ad agencies. I recall at the time they appointed, as it was, Ogilvy and Mather to look after the whole thing. And that way they managed the whole thing, made it consistent. But that's the main thing I think we're finding often with a lot of management today, is focus, focus, and more focus, and you stick to your knitting. And that's where IBM has been so incredibly successful.
Thank you.
Jeremy, I was just wondering, in terms of local food and beverage brands, especially if you look at developed markets, you see that private label brand penetration is as high as 75% in the US, for example. Now I'm just wondering whether or not you think locally private label brand penetration is actually taking off, and the ability of local food manufacturers to add economic value as a result of their brands, whether that's actually dwindling.
Again, a very good question. I don't know, what are the figures locally? I hear figures bandied around from 15, 20, 50. It depends on category. I think one of the challenges in South Africa is the lack of manufacturing capability and capacity. Because I think you find that if there's one organisation dominates in one field, often they're producing their own branded goods and they're producing private label. And that's where life gets complicated. We're not like in Europe where they can find lots of different suppliers and go to them. But there was a thing in the latest marketing magazine from the UK that, again, with the recessionary times, people are getting the retailers are getting very concerned because they're pushing private label more and more. And that, of course, is pushing up their profit margin. And that means the major manufacturers are having a tougher time. One of the companies' name was Coca-Cola, where they have to be careful not to find they're being undercut, their profit margins getting too high. Some of you will remember a few years ago, 15, Marlborough was charging more and more of a premium, and people came in and undercut them. And then we had Marlborough Friday, where the share price just plummeted. A lot of people said that was the end of the brand, but Marlborough still today is a huge brand. But if you take too much of a profit margin, you get really too cheeky, it creates the opportunity for someone to come in underneath you. It's interesting as well, often I find, in our household, I tend to go out often on a Sunday morning myself and do a little bit of a shop, just as a way of seeing what's going on. And I get very upset going into a pick and pay when I see no name brands more expensive than the main manufacturing brands. But that's cheeky, and that's pick and pay. Perhaps Mr. Brayshaw will change that, I don't know. There's a hand up over there.
Yeah, we're going to take the last 2 questions, last 3. Here, and then 2 over there.
Hello, sir. I find the BlackBerry case quite interesting. I mean, if you compare BlackBerry here and BlackBerry abroad, what I wanted to know was how much of that brand strength here, according to strength, how much would you attribute to our delayed response in adoption as opposed to maybe a difference in consumer culture?
Very good question again. Look, I think around the world that business people have adopted BlackBerry. We know that. But I think the big thing in South Africa is, again, the youngsters. I mean, you're a youngster, but you know, the teenagers use BlackBerry because, help me here, the bundles that you can buy for texting, etc., which are packages that are no extra cost. And I know my youngest daughter, who's now 22, you know, she's been on BlackBerry until the last ones because there was that advantage of once you had a BlackBerry and you had the package, it gave you all these additional extras. I was beating her up every month when I saw the bill in any case, and this way it brought the bills down. But I think this is where sometimes you can do tactical devices. BlackBerry, as I say, probably South Africa is one of the strongest countries it's in, but would it be sustainable? And that to me is going to be a very interesting question.
Well, it is a cheap option for smartphones to have compared to Apple.
Are you saying it is or not?
Well, I chose BlackBerry over Apple because I felt it was a cheaper option.
I just get upset with the mobile service providers there because they're all about one thing, and that's confusion. Do you understand the package you're getting? And they all seem to be as bad as each other. At the moment, you know, again, with daughters going in and having to sign the sureties and things, I'm saying, well, what does that mean? And they don't seem to be able to explain to you either. So wherever you go, there's more and more confusion. But that's the name of the game. That's where I think it's going to be interesting to see if Alan Craig at CLC does as he says he's going to do, cuts through some of the jargon.
Yeah. What I'm very interested in understanding is that we've reached a place where the global conversation is moving towards the fact that we've reached the limits to growth. We are moving into a space in 3 years from 2007 to 2010 where during the recession, sustainability has now become something that was living on the periphery into being embedded into the core strategy of companies. You have to look at different value completely with your shareholders. You're moving into a completely different space of engaging around sustainability. Obviously, there's profit to be made in that sustainability space if you innovate. How is that going to impact in terms of valuing on that triple bottom line and into the DNA of the organization in terms of just brands and sales? Because it goes far beyond that. Investor value, you know, the space that we're talking about is a huge topic. So how are you going to be valuing that? And what are you doing kind of from a future-focused perspective? Because it's becoming imperative. It's reached the limits to growth. You can't trim your sales anymore. You've got to innovate.
Very good question. You all hear that? I'd like to invite you to the Executive MBA session tomorrow morning starting at 8:30, where I'm going to be talking about corporate citizenship and sustainability. Because you make a very good point. I think in recessionary times, in some areas, sustainability, like what we call it, green sustainability, within Interbrand we call it corporate citizenship, which seems to be the umbrella. Yes, it's becoming more and more important. Yes, to the very big companies, it can give you a corporate advantage. People like the Procter & Gamble's and Unilevers especially are throwing at each other all the time, and that's good for consumers, so they're both competing. But in a lot of other areas, we found that with the recessionary times, it's gone back down the priority list of some countries. I think that in the automotive side, people realized that Toyota were getting an edge on everyone, so they started following the Toyota way, if I can put it that way, getting rid of the gas guns. That's all apart from General Motors. We didn't seem to care too much. But I think it's one of those subjects that people are conscious of. It's a bit like digital in some things, that some of the older members of management think, well, does it really matter? You know, on my watch, do we need to think sustainability? Do we want to think digital? Within the Lurie Awards, and some of you are from the advertising world, 3 years ago, they introduced a session, well, an award for sustainability. And I was a judge the previous 2 years. And it was interesting that a lot of the entries we found didn't understand what sustainability was about. And some of them were spending a lot of money advertising how good they were. And then we realized that they were spending more on the advertising budget than they were. So we got a bit cynical, I'm afraid. We've had a couple of sessions with our head of New York, a guy called Tom Zara, who heads up the team. He did a big presentation to Harvard Business School in December last year. And he was explaining how the Americans see it, and we were talking about Africa. And I mentioned the word Ubuntu, and I'm probably not the person in the room who understands it most, but he loved the concept of Ubuntu. And that to him was another sort of string to his bow, talking to the future. So I think more and more people are responding to sustainability depending on what their competition is doing. If it's going to make them money, then yes. If it's going to build investor relations with the investment community, yes. And other people are saying, well, let's just leave it there for the moment and see what happens. We didn't hear about that, but I just want to add one thing on sustainability. To me, one of the best examples of sustainability in the last few months is the London Olympics. Going there, I hadn't realised that to start with, that area of London Stratford had been a heavy industrial area in Victorian times, to the point that the earth was so poisoned that nothing would grow on it. And the first thing they had to do, and this was part of their bid for the Olympics, was to say they were going to clean the soil, as it were, and that way regenerate the area, and then plant it, and bring it back to life, as it were. And that was one of the big things they did. But also, going around the Olympic Park, the way they had the refuse collection was all clearly coded and named and numbered, to the point that for the afternoon I was there, I think they had, the figure was about 250,000 people were processed in 2 sittings each day at the Olympic Park. Because apart from the stadium, which was about 80,000, 90,000, there were the other areas as well. And you didn't see any litter anywhere. People were so well behaved, it was incredible. But to see the legacy of those Olympics, obviously the jury's out now, to see how things are developed and the stadia are going to be used so they don't become white elephants. And they become of use to the community.
We have to take the last question as we're running out of time.
Jeremy, 2 of the biggest clients being Apple and Samsung. How much of their growth can you think is attributed to the product development in the sort of iPad and the tablet area?
Good question again. I think, I wish I had the slide that Apple showed the other night, because when you think over the 36 years what it's done, and people forget that it nearly went bankrupt. But the last decade has launched new things all the time. And whether it's the iPhone 5, and what you're saying is interesting, they've got a whole production line that they're keeping rolling out. They're keeping the hype going, they're keeping the excitement, they're keeping people on tenterhooks around the world. Then you hear queues around blocks, you hear about people fighting to get through the doors when they open. The hype that they've built and they're maintaining is amazing. Despite that, Samsung is coming. Samsung with its tablet, with its technology. Interesting how the main weapon that Samsung and Apple are using against each other is the legal route. So it's a great time to be a lawyer, especially if you're in patents and trademarks and that sort of area. That's it, all right? Good. So it's important to do that. But I think another brand that we're watching very closely is Amazon. Because with the Kindle and the news of the Fire Kindle, that's creating huge traction as well. And Jeff Bezos is a very savvy guy. He's been written off and he's kept on going. And he says that he doesn't want you just to buy a Kindle. You'll make more money as you keep on using it and buying things. So he's building an annuity as well, and he's adding to his income stream. So I think, we're in for a very exciting time. Anyone want to place their bets on what's going to be number one for next year? That's too big. Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. And before we invite you for a drink and a snack with us, I'd like to ask Justine from DLA to give a half minute. Thanks.
Jeremy, on behalf of Bazaar's Graduate School of Business and DLA Capital Healthcare, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation this evening. As consumers and in doing business, it's so easy to forget the powerful tool that branding can play in the decisions that we make as consumers, and the tool that can be in doing business as suppliers. So thank you very much for bringing these statistics to us. It's very interesting to see what potentially can happen next year. And it's an incredibly interesting sphere of work that you're in. So thank you very much. Please accept this small gift as a token of our appreciation of your presentation today. Thank you very much.